Hey, MP class. It's good to see you guys. Happy Monday. I wanted to give you a quick update on what's going on this week, and then we'll dive into the notes. The first one's for the respiratory system. Okay, so first of all, hopefully you're getting the Master in AMP imported or completed by the time that's due today. And then secondly, the respiratory system lab is posted on Canvas under the Laboratories module. So just go to the Laboratories module. At the very top of the modules, you'll see Respiratory System Online Lab there. It's a Word document. You can download that. Start completing that by using that in Master in AMP. The quiz portion that you'll turn in on Canvas that's due by 5 o'clock p.m. on this Friday. That part's not there yet, but it'll be posted later today. You can definitely start working on the other if you want. Secondly, it's time to work on discussion board 2, so hop on there. If you haven't yet, you guys are asking some great questions, and you're helping out your classmates in great ways with the previous discussion board, so hop on there. Again, your questions are due by tonight, so make sure you post, or sorry, not tonight, but Tuesday night. And then your responses to everybody's questions are due by Wednesday night. Okay? And those are all 11:59 p.m. due dates on those. Remember, exam 4 is coming up this week. And what I cover right now on the respiratory system will be the last thing that's on exam 4 that's new. Okay? And what we do on Wednesday will be new material for exam 5. All right? So, yeah, and then I do plan on holding a semi mandatory slash I'd really like for you all to be there synchronous Zoom session on Wednesday this week at 9:30 to do a review session. Okay, so that would be driven by you guys asking questions. I can answer questions and I can go over some stuff as well to help us get ready for the exam on Friday. Okay, so 9:30 on Wednesday. We'll try to do that. All right, let me just show you the syllabus here real quick, just so you can see where we're at. Okay, so right here, March 30th. All right, that Master in AMP 5's due. Here's your class. Here's your pages for the reading for this. All right, discussion board 2. The responses are due on Wednesday, but again, get those questions that you have posted by Tuesday. On this Wednesday, we're going to do a 9:30 a.m. synchronous review session. Okay, there's no points for being there or not being there. I would love as many of you to be there as possible. Okay, and then Friday we'll have exam 4. This is synchronous at our normal time. Okay, 1:45 p.m. on Friday, exam 4. And you'll be using Honor Lock for that. All right. All right, guys, well, let's get into these notes. All right, so diving into the respiratory system, and as we do with all new systems, I like to kind of remind us of where we've been and where we're headed next. Okay, so we've talked about things at the chemical and the cellular level, right? We talked about how those cells came together to create tissues, how those tissues came together to create organ systems, right? And our first organ system was the skeletal system. Then we got into the muscular system. We've talked about the nervous system, the endocrine system, reproductive system, cardiovascular system. We talked about metabolism. We talked about the muscular system. And again, all of those cells inside of each of these tissues can survive with more than a matter of minutes without one thing. What is that one thing? ATP, right? And to make ATP, we need oxygen. And to get oxygen, we need the respiratory system. Okay. All right, so some fun facts about the respiratory system, or about the lungs at least. The surface area of the lungs is massive. Okay, so when we look at how much surface area we have in our lungs, we have around 1,000 square feet of surface area. And why? Well, first of all, that is the size of a tennis court. Okay, so we look at that size of a tennis court right there, one half of a tennis court. So if we laid out the surface area of our lungs into one flat surface, it would take up one whole side of a tennis court. Okay, the more surface area we have, the more chances for diffusion we have, the more opportunities we have to put little capillary beds on top of little bubbles that are called alveoli that allow for oxygen to diffuse into the blood. Okay, so how many alveoli do we have? These are our little alveoli, these little sacs. We have around 300 to 500 million of these. Okay, and how long are our airways total? If we added up every single little tube like this, we have about 1,500 miles of airway tube in our lungs. All right, so let's talk about an overview, getting at the functions of the respiratory system. Okay, obviously number one is just to get air down to that alveoli, all those little alveoli, so we can get the diffusion to happen. Okay, and then step two would be exchange gases with the blood, right? So put some oxygen into the blood from the air and get some CO2 out, right? That's a gas exchange that happens. This is the alveolus, where the air is. This is the blood vessel, capillary. And then obviously speech, okay? Tone is produced in the larynx, and then we add richness, changes the sound of it via the nasal cavity, oral cavity, and the pharynx. Okay, and then it's shaped at the end by our lips and our tongue. Okay, and then obviously olfaction, that sense of smell, is part of the respiratory system as well. So there's some functions of the respiratory system. Okay, and then there's different processes that we'll talk about in the respiratory system. Number one, it's called ventilation. This is just moving air, right? Moving air in and out of the lungs. Number two is called external respiration. This is the gas exchange between the air in the lungs and in the blood. Okay, that's that gas exchange. Gas transport is next. Okay, the blood carries the gases down to the cells, okay, or back from the cells, okay? And then internal respiration is the second level of gas exchange we have when we exchange gases between the blood and the tissues. And then lastly, cellular respiration, right, or cell metabolism, will be using oxygen in the oxidative phosphorylation to produce CO2 and to produce energy. Okay, so those are the 5 processes of respiration that are kind of all related to this respiratory system. Okay, so very important histological feature of the respiratory system is it's all lined by ciliated mucous membranes, right? They line all the airways, all right? So they contain a bunch of those unicellular goblet cells, all right? Those secrete mucus. And then there's cilia, little hairs on the airway side, as you can see here. Okay, and the functions of those are, number one is to moisten the air as it comes in, which helps us reduce water loss when we breathe out. And then we also protect our respiratory system in our body by mucus catching things like microbes when they're coming in. Okay, so the mucus catches it, and then the cilia beats in the right direction to send the mucus back up this respiratory tube, up into your mouth, where then it can take a U-turn and go right back down your esophagus, into the digestive tract and out for excretion. Okay, so smoking strongly affects this. It pretty much directly destroys cilia. Smoking creates more particles to deal with as well, just a bunch more junk to send down there, so it puts more stress on the cilia. So eventually this leads to reduced ability to deal with the particles that are normally coming in, even outside of smoking. Okay, so a little anatomy of the respiratory passageways here. Starting up here in the upper right, this is the microanatomy. Okay, so A is the smallest level of tube that we have, known as the alveolar duct. It's just the last little tube right here, last little tube system before we get to the little balls of air, which are the alveoli. Okay, so the alveoli are those little balls. That was B. C are the second to last little tubes. Those are known as respiratory bronchioles. Okay, and then D is just an alveolar sac. Okay, it's a sac full of multiple of those little balls, which are called alveoli. Okay, so that's all the microanatomy. This is what we have at the end of all of ours. Remember, we had 3 to 500 million of those little sacs. Okay. Then let's look at the other cavities here. So E would be the nasal cavity, working our way down to F, oral cavity, G as we're working our way down, so we go nasal, down into the oral. Next is the pharynx, that's kind of just like the throat, okay? And then instead of going this way, which would be digestive tract, and getting to the esophagus, air goes this way, right? So it goes through the hole, the glottis, we'll talk about in a second, but then into the larynx, and the larynx is the voice box. All right, from the larynx, we go down into the trachea, it's the largest of the tubes in our respiratory system. Next, we split off into the left and right main or primary bronchus. All right, so main bronchus. Okay, and those are all the tubular systems or the air passageways. Okay, so the structures in each, we'll start with the nose. Okay, so obviously we have the external nose we've talked about, then the external nares, which are the nostrils. So there's the holes there. Okay, and then we have the nasal cavity, which is all up in here. Right, it's divided between left and right by the nasal septum. Okay, and then the hard palate separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. Okay, and then we have internal nares, which are the openings between the nasal cavity and the pharynx. Okay, and that's pretty much back here. We open that up to connect the nasal cavity with the throat. Okay, functions of the nose. The nose is the cleaner way to breathe. It does a lot of filtering, so it filters out bacteria, viruses, dust. The hairs of the nose catch larger particles. And then how much mucus per day is produced? About a liter of mucus just in the nose. Okay, just in the nose, a liter is produced. And what happens there is that as the air passes through, those mucous membranes that line the nose will catch all those particles, and then also the nose will warm and moisten the air because of the rich blood supply and very thin epithelium. Okay, so this image shows nicely the rich blood supply. This is why microbes can, if they get in your nose, can get right into your bloodstream. This is also why drugs, like cocaine, as far as a lethal drug or an illicit drug goes, but then other drugs like nasal steroids and things like that, things that you can are easily, it's an easy way to get them into your body is through the nose, because those blood vessels are right there. Okay, and the lungs can't really handle cold or dry air. That damages the lungs. And so the nose is good at warming and moistening the air. Okay? And and this is better than the mouth at doing it because mucus is better than saliva for warming up and moistening air. Okay? And then obviously smell for the nose. Okay, so the pharynx is the throat. So this is a muscular tube lined by a mucous membrane. Remember, it's all mucous membranes. Okay, this connects the nasal and oral cavities to the esophagus and to the larynx. Okay, so what passes through the pharynx? Both food and drink and air. So this is a shared part of the passageway. Okay, and now the larynx breaks up into three different parts. The pharynx breaks up into three different parts. The nasopharynx, oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Okay, so you can see those differences there. Function of oropharynx prevents food from entering the nasal cavity. That's the function of the uvula. Okay, that's the kind of little thing that lifts up in the back of your throat that blocks the nasal cavity when you're swallowing. We'll look at that more when we look at the digestive tract. Okay, and then the laryngopharynx is below the oropharynx. We'll see that in image here in a sec. Okay, and then we move down into the larynx, which will be past the pharynx. Pharynx is the throat, larynx is the voice box. Okay, remember this is a muscular tube lined by mucous membrane, just like all of them are, but it has a little bit of cartilaginous support, keeps it open. Okay, and that's important, that keeps it open when we're sucking air in, also when we're eating a big bite of food. that in our esophagus stretches and pushes towards the larynx. It doesn't completely close it up. Okay, so now we're in the only air-only part. Okay, so this is not shared between food and air anymore. Okay, we have the glottis, which is the opening to the laryngopharynx. This is made out of cartilage, or it's cartilage ring. The epiglottis is what covers this up during swallowing. Okay, and then there's extrinsic muscles of the larynx that pull the larynx up during swallowing, and then the epiglottis is pushed down during swallowing. So the larynx lifts up to meet the epiglottis that's kind of pushed down a little bit. And the epiglottis is made of elastic cartilage. So if anything but air gets into the larynx, like a little drop of water, a little piece of food, we have a reflexive action to cough. Okay, this is what the larynx looks like. We have vestibular folds in there, which you can see here. So these are these more skin-like projections here. And these prevent food from entering and prevent air from leaving when you're holding your breath. Okay, but then we have the vocal cords, which are the white part in the middle. These are bands of connective tissue, somewhat like ligaments, that vibrate when you're exhaling. Okay, so the pitch of the sound that's made is regulated by the length and the tension of the cords. Okay, so the longer they are, the lower or the deeper voice, right? The tighter they are, the higher. Okay, and tension is regulated by intrinsic muscles, kind of just like guitar strings, right? When we think of guitar strings, the ones that make the lowest pitch are the longer ones, right? The bigger ones, and they're the longer ones. Those are the deepest sounds. Okay, so let's go ahead and label this throat. All right, so if we're looking at all the structures here, we'll start out with A. Oh, excuse me. Which one is the oropharynx? That's the one we'll start with. So we've got nasopharynx would be up here, right? Laryngopharynx will be down here. The one that's right behind the mouth is the oropharynx, and that one's C. Okay, now we'll go back to A. A is the nasopharynx. B is this little hole that looks like it's coming from up there somewhere, right? What would that be? That's the passageway of the pharyngotympanic tube up into the middle ear, right? What about D? D is that laryngopharynx, so it's below the oropharynx. The next part down of the pharynx is the laryngopharynx. Okay, then we got E, which is the soft palate. Okay, and then at the very tip of that is the uvula, and then 4 is the hard palate. And then we see G is the epiglottis. That's that elastic cartilage that's going to lift up or going to push down a little bit when we swallow. And then H is the trachea. Okay, I is the thyroid gland. You can see that pushing out right there. J would be the esophagus, so that's the digestive tract, not respiratory tract. And then K is the larynx. Okay, so remember when we swallow, this larynx moves up, epiglottis moves down just a little bit, but it's more about that motion of the larynx to cover that up. All right, make sure you know those structures well. Okay, so now moving down the respiratory tract into the trachea. This is past the larynx now, into the trachea, and so the trachea is another muscular tube lined by mucous membrane, supported by rings of hyaline cartilage. Okay, the function of this is to keep the trachea from collapsing due to negative pressure with inhaling. We'll talk about that when we take a big breath in. That causes us to create negative pressure. Okay, and that negative pressure is could make this collapse. And so hopefully it doesn't, but the thing that really helps it from doing that is those cartilage rings. Okay, and also, like I mentioned before, if we take way too big of a bite for some reason, then our esophagus is going to stretch out, and it's right next to that, so it's going to push right on that and could smash it down if we let it. But that cartilage helps with not letting it get smashed down. Okay, moving our way down a little bit further into the bronchial tree. Okay, we've already looked at some of those structures in there. We've got two primary bronchi, which are right and left. Those have cartilage rings as well. Inner layer is ciliated epithelium. Then we get down from primary to secondary to tertiary. The tubes just get smaller and smaller until we get down to those little tiny bronchioles that don't have cartilage, but they do have smooth muscle. Okay, and this is what allows us to change airway size. Okay, so we have sympathetic nervous system activation, which would cause the bronchioles to dilate because we want more air when we're stressed. And then secondly, we want parasympathetic nervous system activation, which would cause constriction. It would do the opposite. So those two have those two opposite effects. This is just a diagram that shows you all the little structures going from where the air comes in, number one, all the way down to the end, the alveolar sacs. Okay, so next, when we keep making our way down to the very end of that series of air passageways, we found the alveoli, which is the end. Okay, and those alveoli, again, are those big clusters of sacs here, which are tiny. They're microscopic. And their function of these is for where the gas exchange can happen, right? And they're just totally covered with capillary beds, right? Because that's the gas exchange that needs to happen. Okay, and you can see there's these elastic fibers around them, and that makes them elastic. So when we stretch them out, when we take a deep breath, then they bounce back to help us exhale that air out. Okay, there's two main types of cells within there. There's the type 1 pneumocytes, which is squamous epithelial tissue, which that's exactly what we want. We want nice flat cells so things can, oxygen can diffuse right through. Okay, and then there's the type 2 pneumocytes, which secrete a substance called surfactant. And that's what's going to break the surface tension that we'll talk about in one sec. Okay, and then we also have macrophages that we find in here, which are present for protection of anything that does make it through all those mucous membranes and barriers. And we have some immune system cells to destroy anything that gets down there. Okay, well, let's talk about the surfactant here for 1 second again. We'll talk about this more when we talk about another disorder of the respiratory system. But surfactant, surfactant is kind of acts like a detergent. Okay, really what it does is it gets between the water molecules. So if we have H2O, right, and then another H2O, another H2O, right, we're going to create these hydrogen bonds between the waters, or the hydrogens and the oxygens, right? And the alveoli are so small that the space between from one side of an alveoli to the next is enough for water to span the gap. Right? So water can actually span that gap, and if those are trying to stick to each other, then that can actually make those alveoli collapse, the walls collapse. Okay, so we need a chemical that acts as a detergent to break these hydrogen bonds, and that's what surfactant does. And that's not released till later on towards the end of the fetal development, and this is why premature babies have a hard time breathing. Okay, so the lungs, again, we've got right and left. Obviously, you know that. The right is larger. It actually has 3 lobes, and the left only has 2. This is because we need room for the heart. Okay, they're surrounded by what's known as the pleural membrane. Again, this is one of those serous membranes. Serous membrane that has 2 layers, right? So there's the parietal side, which is closer to the ribs, and then there's the visceral side, which is closer to the lungs. Okay, and then the pleural cavity is the space between those. Okay, so that space, that fluid-filled space between those, helps us cut down on friction with the lungs lifting, moving, expanding, and then the pressure in that space must stay less than the pressure inside the lungs, or else the lungs collapse. We'll talk about that more next time. Okay, so here's the anatomy. Here's what it looks like. So again, this is zooming in on that space where we see the membranes. Okay, so we have We have an inner membrane, an outer membrane, and then this fluid-filled space in the middle, right? So that fluid-filled space in the middle is the pleural cavity. Okay, we can see it here as well. Fluid-filled space. So then B is the membrane that's closer to the lungs, so that would be the visceral pleura. Right? C is the membrane that's further away from the lungs, that's the parietal pleura. And then D are the pulmonary arteries, just kind of an interesting view. And then E, we can see, are those big right and left primary bronchi. Just interesting to note, this is where the abdominal aorta goes down. This is another large vessel leading up to the vena cava, and this is the esophagus right there. Okay, so let's look a little bit at what are known as respiratory volumes. You guys are going to look at these in the respiration lab this week. You'll look at an image that looks somewhat like this. And this is an image from what's called a spirometry test, where you have something you put on your mouth, you plug your nose, you breathe into it, and then you breathe out, breathe in. So every time you breathe air out into it, every time you breathe air in, when you inhale, this graph goes up. When you exhale, this graph goes down. Okay, so this is what's called normal tidal volume. Okay, so tidal volume is just the in and the out with each breath. Okay, and then we have what's known as inspiratory reserve volume, which would be you take as deep of a breath in as you possibly can, and so that's full forced inspiration. What's the volume of air above and beyond tidal volume that you can breathe in? And that is your inspiratory reserve volume, or IRV. And then secondly, we have our expiratory reserve volume, which is going to be above and beyond tidal volume. How much air can we possibly blow out of our lungs? Okay. And then lastly, we have a residual volume, which you don't even see the graph getting down here, right? Because that's the amount of air you can't push out, because we can't totally flatten out our alveoli to push the air out. Okay? And then these volumes are going to come together to create these capacities. Okay? And you're going to, on this slide, you should be able to put those volumes together to create the equations for those capacities. So to get your total inspiratory capacity, we're adding together tidal volume plus that amount, that IRV. Okay? Functional residual capacity, or FRC, is our expiratory reserve volume plus our residual volume. Vital capacity, I like to think of it as the total movable air in the lungs. So that's inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, plus expiratory reserve volume. And then our total lung capacity would just be taking this and then adding what's left, which is our residual volume. Okay, ventilation is a little bit different. It can be calculated very similar to cardiac output. Remember, cardiac output was heart rate times stroke volume. So that was how many beats per minute times how much blood per beat. This is how many breaths per minute here, respiratory rate, times how much air with each breath. Okay, so that's usually expressed in liters per minute. Okay, so to calculate that, we could have our tidal volume here in mils per minute, respiratory rate in beats per minute, 12, so 500 times 12. That would be a normal resting. Normal maximum might be somewhere around 4,500 mils, 45 breaths per minute. So we calculate those. So we've got to take that 500 mils times the 12 BPM. So this is mils per breath, really, right? And this is breaths per minute. Okay. And so let's convert that to liters first, because we want our answer to be in liters, right? So 500 converted to liters would be just take this, move it over 1, 2, 3 spots. So we got 0.5 liters per breath times 12 breaths per minute, right? So since we got a breath on the top, breath on the bottom, those cancel out. And so now we're going to end up with 0.5 times 6, or 0.5 times 12, which would be 6. We're left with the liters per minute, right? Okay, same thing over here. We've got 4,500 mils Let's convert that to 4.5 liters because we moved it over 1, 2, 3. Okay, liters per breath times 45 breaths per minute. All right, we're going to cancel out the breaths again, and we're left with 45 times 4.5, which will be 202.5 liters per minute. All right, so you should be able to know how to do those calculations. All right, guys, that's all we got for today. We'll see you on Wednesday, hopefully. Bye-bye.